And thank you so much, all of you, for being here. I've worked on this book for 4 years, and after spending all that time in isolation working on it, it's just so exciting to find anyone who actually wants to read it, let alone anyone who wants to argue about it. The paradox that lies at the heart of this book is that we live in an age in which it is effortless to telecommute across the globe, in which we all could decide to sit in some sylvan spot that appeals to our biophilia and just dial it in. And yet, on so many dimensions, cities are healthier and more successful than ever. In the developed world, cities are centers of just remarkable productivity. If per capita output levels in the rest of the country rose to those found in New York, our national GDP would increase by 43%. The three largest metropolitan areas in the U.S. produce 18% of our country's output while containing only 13% of our country's population. The connection between urbanization and economic prosperity is even stronger in the developing world. If you compare those countries with more than 50% of the population living in urban areas with those that have less than 50% of the population living in urban areas, you'll find that the more urbanized countries are more than 5 times more prosperous, 5 times richer. They also have infant mortality levels that are 1/3 as high. And they also have people who describe themselves as being considerably more satisfied with their lives and their jobs. That cities are the paths out of poverty into prosperity for so much of the world. Of course, we've seen the success of places like New York, not just in terms of their income. Cities are also fun, they're green, they're healthy. They're exciting places to be where the magic of human interactions tends to make a place just so much more exciting. Now, the idea behind this book, the reason, the claim that the book makes for why cities have come back, is that cities play to humankind's greatest asset, which is our ability to learn from people around us. We come out of the womb with this remarkable ability to learn from our parents, from our peers, from our siblings, from people around us who are doing things that are really smart, and from people around us who are screwing up. Cities make that happen. Cities are the absence of space between people, their proximity, their density, their closeness. And coming to a city like New York, you experience this onrush of human experience that teaches you. When we observe the wages of people who actually come to cities, it's not as if they immediately become more productive in the cities overnight. What happens is year by year, month after month, they experience faster wage growth. They, over years, become more productive. And that's really compatible with this view that cities are machines for learning, forges of human capital. As the great English economist Alfred Marshall said more than a century ago, in dense clusters, the mysteries of the trade become no mystery, but are, as it were, in the air. That's, I think, very much how places like New York and San Francisco and London work. And precisely because globalization and new technologies have increased the returns to being smart, they've increased the returns to innovation, they're actually working for cities rather than against them. While it is certainly true that globalization and new technologies caused the garment industry to disappear from New York City, they didn't eliminate the returns to coming up with good fashion ideas at all. They didn't eliminate the value to creating new images in New York. Because after all, you can now sell them on the other side of the planet. You can produce them on the other side of the planet. You can take advantage of all of the opportunities in a more globalized world, but taking advantage of that requires new ideas, requires innovations, and we get smart by being around other smart people. Now, things didn't always look so bright in New York City. When I was a kid growing up here in the 1970s, it looked as if not just President Ford, but history itself was telling New York to drop dead. Right? The city seemed mired in crime and disorder. The decline of that garment industry felt as if it had left the city essentially unmoored. Now, that situation was not unusual for New York, because what New York was going through was a process of deindustrialization and decline that was common to all of America's older, colder cities. One of the themes of this book is that the American dream doesn't have to lie behind a white picket fence in the suburb, and that cities have been as intrinsic to American history and to our experience as a nation as any place else. The very birth of America has its roots in urban interactions in Boston in the 1770s between John Hancock, who badly wanted the political change that could be created by a mob, and Sam Adams, who, like many purveyors of liquor, knew how to conjure a mob. And their connections as created by the city of Boston changed America, helped create this great country of ours. In the 19th century, the great problem was making the wealth of the American interior accessible to the markets of the East and to Europe. Cities made that happen. They grew up as nodes of a great transportation network that enabled the rich, dark soil of Iowa to become productive. If you go back to 1816, it cost as much to move goods 32 miles over land as it did to ship them across the Atlantic. It was enormously difficult to access all the wealth that was in the American hinterland. Cities grew up then as nodes of this great transportation network. The cities that grew up along the Erie Canal, the Chicago, which started off when the Illinois and Michigan Canal created a great watery arc that spanned all the way from New York to New Orleans. Rails only supplemented that transportation network that was initially based on water. Indeed, every one of the 20 largest cities in America in 1900 was on a major waterway, from the oldest, like New York and Boston, which were typically where the river meets the sea, to the newest, Minneapolis, on the northernmost navigable point on the Mississippi River. Industry then grew up around those transportation nodes. New York's three great industries in the 19th century were sugar refining, printing and publishing, and garment production. All of them were intimately tied to the port. Sugar refining, of course, because New York was part of a great triangle trade that involved the Caribbean, and there was plenty of raw sugar coming into New York, which is how Isaac Roosevelt, the founder of FDR's family fortune, got involved in the sugar refining business. Right. He also was actually an anti-British agitator because British mercantilist rules interfered with his sugar trade. Printing and publishing is one of my favorite stories because the big money in 19th century printing and publishing was in printing pirated English novels. Right. You had to come out with the latest Dickens or the latest Walter Scott and get it out first. Now, New York's port made that happen. The thing that made the Harper brothers succeed in the 1920s was the fact that they could get the latest Walter Scott novel. They could get Peveril of the Peak faster than their Philadelphia competitors, Carey and Lee, because they were in New York. They were in this great port that actually got the books first and that enabled them to print first and dominate the market. Chicago as well, right? Chicago's greatest industry, the stockyards, of course, grew up around its rail yard. Those stockyards were right next to rail. And in Detroit, an even more remarkable event occurred in the rise of its automobile industry. And it shows the ability of cities that form for often mundane reasons to then create these chains of innovation that create some of humankind's greatest endeavors. So if you go back to mid-19th century Detroit, it's a city of small firms, smart people, and connections to the outside world. And it's a city with a huge amount of inland trade, and it has a great business in taking care of the engines that are on the ships going on the Great Lakes. So Detroit Dry Dock, a seminal firm in the 19th century, Frank Kirby, a great shipping entrepreneur, comes there, and they then perform a critical role educating young people who work with engines, like Henry Ford. Henry Ford gets his start with engines in Detroit Dry Dock. He then becomes part of a great chain of entrepreneurship. Detroit in the 1900s, early 1900s, feels a lot like Silicon Valley in the 1960s. There's basically an automotive genius on every street corner. David Dunbar Buick, the Fisher brothers, the Dodge brothers, all of whom are inventing and innovating and stealing each other's ideas and supplying each other with inputs, all of whom desperately are trying to figure out the new thing. And they do it. And they create this amazing thing, the mass-produced, inexpensive automobile. Now, one of the tragedies of Detroit, and unfortunately there are going to be several tragedies of Detroit that I'm going to talk about in the next couple of minutes, is that the way they figure it out is by the way they're able to make mass-produced automobiles is by doing something that's fundamentally antithetical to cities. They do it by creating great walled-off factories that are vertically integrated and that provide employment for less educated Americans on a grand scale. Now, on one level, this is great. Extremely productive and providing jobs for those Americans who start with less education. That's wonderful. But nothing could be more antithetical to what makes cities work than Ford's River Rouge plant. Great wall surrounding the area, little connection with the people around them. And for a while, it's wildly productive. But when the economics change, when transportation costs fall, that production can easily move, and it can move to lower cost areas like the right to work states. Then, of course, automobile production can cross the globe. And when those conditions change, Detroit didn't have the stuff to reinvent itself because it didn't have the culture of entrepreneurship, because it didn't have the skills that were so intrinsic to urban renewal. Now, of course, a second tragedy of Detroit is the way that the government responded to it was exactly the opposite of what, in fact, Detroit needed.